So since there are two ways to solve this, I will show you both ways. The first way, we do the same thing we were doing before. We have 2/3 smushed onto x. That smush means multiply. To undo multiplying, I'm going to divide both sides by 2/3. Writing that can look weird though. So normally we do this fraction bar and then write down what we're dividing by. And now I have a fraction over a fraction. Dear God, why? But at least the left side is x. So whatever the heck 14/15 divided by 2/3 is our answer. We can do it though. So we have 14/15. Now instead of that big fraction bar, I'm going to go back to old school division and 2/3. So in order to divide by a fraction, we multiply by the opposite, the reciprocal rather, not the opposite. So I'm just going to put an arrow here to crunch this because I'm running out of room. So it is times 3/2. And now that 3 on top and the 15 on the bottom, I can divide the top and the bottom by 3. So we are dividing by 3. And then 15 divided by 3 is 5. And then likewise, the 14 and the 2, those are both even. So I can divide by 2 and get 1. And 14 divided by 2 is 7. So I now have 7 times 1 on top and 5 times 1 on the bottom. So our final answer is 7/5. So apparently 2/3 of 7/5 is 14/15. Fancy. Now this one can look a little intimidating because it looks like we're subtracting, and then we have a fraction. Well, before we do that, let me show you the other way you can solve fraction equations, and it'll actually help more on 10 than it will on 9 here. Whew, that got big. All right. So one of the things we can do is clear the fractions out of the equation. So when we get crazier looking equations than this, one of the best steps, the steps that blow my college algebra students' minds when I show them on day 1, we're going to multiply by what the common denominator would be. So I have 2/3 and 14/15. So I need at least 15, and 3 divides into 15. So I am going to choose to multiply both sides by 15. Now that's allowable per our equality rules. So that is our first step. I'm going to take this side here, multiply by just 15, not 15 over 15, just 15 technically over 1 if you want to see a denominator. Now we do that because over here on the right, 15 and 15, top and bottom, those divide to 1. 14 times 1 is 14. Now over here, 15 on top, 3 on the bottom, that 3 divides into 15 5 times. 5 times 2 is 10x. Now look at all the stuff we had in black. Look at what I just wrote down there in green. Poof, the fractions are gone. Magic. So that step, even for really crazy equations, this step can clear the fractions. It can make them go away. So the equation you end up with might have larger numbers because you got rid of the fractions, but they're all going to be whole numbers. Now here, 10x's equals 14, but I want to know 1x, so I divide it into tenths. Divide by 10. Divide by 10. And you see how nice it looks with the different color? Then 14 divided by 10, well, those are even, so that would be 7 divided by 5. That sounds familiar. Because that's what we got. All right. Now let's take a look at 10 here. Now, in some ways, I am kind of overcomplicating it, but most people get like panic attacks for fractions. So I find just taking a step, clearing the fractions, and then you can just focus on solving it from there takes some anxiety off most people's minds. You don't have to do it this way, but it's nice to have it as a tool in your toolbox. So -5/4 of x equals 10. I don't like the fraction, so I want to get rid of it. I only have the one denominator 4, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. The entire left side, the entire right side. Now on the left, we chose to multiply by 4, so they would cancel. We do still have that minus, that negative, so this is -5x. And then on the right side, 10 times 4 is 40. Now, if you had a calculator, you could just divide both sides by -5/4. And then on your calculator, you'd type 10 divided by, and then in parentheses, -5/4. Enter, and it would give you the answer. Poof. This is if you don't have a calculator, this is a way to make the equation less painful. All right, and now to get x by itself, that is -5 times x. Now this is where people will make a mistake sometimes and they'll want to add 5 to both sides. So if we were subtracting 5, if it was -5 plus x, the plus operation between them is what we would cancel. The plus adding a negative, then we would subtract a negative, which is the same as adding a positive. But here, the operation between the number and the x is times. So we need to use division to cancel it out. And with division, you divide by what you see. So we're going to divide both sides by -5. So 40 divided by -5, positive divided by negative is negative. And then 5 goes into 40 8 times. So we can get negative numbers as solutions to the equation. Most of the problems we give you guys are application word problems, so we don't get negative numbers that often. It can happen, but the negative number has to have some meaning in the problem. Okay. So now we have big fancy tips for solving multi-step linear equations. I'm gonna stop this one and then we'll start that next one.